Which Jewish stories are the most important? If you look at the routine of learning in Jewish life, it would seem there's only a small set of stories that are the most important because those get told over and over again and studied and rewritten. It's the Bible, it's the Torah. Those are the Jewish stories that count. Now, from our perspective as humanistic Jews, there are a lot of Jewish stories that count. Those old ones count, they're important, but there's been plenty of writing since the Bible, and there's been plenty of Jewish experience since biblical eras. The real stories are more interesting and more relevant to us, and in some cases, much more diverse than we ever imagined. There are more diverse stories in Jewish life than the simple Ellis Island immigrant family story. We know there are lots of families that came over one or two people at a time who sent back money and then brought the next person over and the next person over. We know that they came in through many ports, not just New York and not just the East Coast even. Some Jews were intentionally diverted to Galveston, Texas, of all places. Some snuck in through the Mexican border, believe it or not. And some came even more circuitous routes. There are very different Jewish experiences that we hear about more and more now, but we don't think about in those earlier days. And most importantly, we learned from the feminist era that the personal is political, that the personal counts. Your story, your family story, our family story, they're important. They are valid Jewish narratives. To put it blithely, which is more meaningful, the wandering of Abraham or the wandering of my bubby and how she got here? Well, we're very pleased to have Aaron Hamburger with us this evening. I'll share with you his brief literary bio that's on his website. If you want to read more, it's aaronhamburger.com. He's an author of short story collections, of 3 novels, and his writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. His latest novel, The Hotel Cuba, was featured in NPR, among a number of other places. He's received numerous awards for his writing. He's taught creative writing at Columbia, GW University, NYU, Brooklyn College, and the Stone Coast MFA program. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Aaron here. I'm going to spotlight his video so that he gets a bigger head than, than anybody else.
Big enough already.
Yeah. And for initially, I'm going to co-spotlight because I have a couple of questions to ask him. But I do want to start by, I don't know how many people have read the novel or haven't, and I'm curious if you want to do like your version of a back of the book summary of the plot so that we're sort of on the same page, and maybe also you can bridge into how you came to write this story and why you found this topic so interesting.
Sure. So maybe I'll combine the two. I'd say early 2017, my brother shared with me this picture of my grandmother that I had never seen, and I'll see if you can all see it. So here she is. This is from 1922, and it's my grandmother in full male drag. And I did some research into women's fashions of the time, and androgyny was kind of a thing then, but women would not be wearing, this is definitely a male outfit. This is not like a female version of, a shirt and tie and pants. So I was just astounded to see this image because I knew my grandmother as this sort of typical Yiddish bubby who spoke to me in halting English with a thick Yiddish accent, even though she came here in her 20s. And I knew her when she was already in her 80s and lived here, for 60 years, but English was never her strength. And she used to bake cookies for me and sing to me, and she's always dressed in a dress with a blouse and very, exactly what you might think of as like a typical Yiddish grandmother. And so when I saw this image, I had to know, well, who is this woman? And so I started digging into some research, and I was amazed by what I found. So my grandmother grew up in this small shtetl in the Pale of Settlement in what is today Belarus on the border of Ukraine, right where all the fighting is happening right now. In the book, she's one of 6 children. In reality, she was one of 11 children, so small family. She was the daughter of the town cantor, but, it was World War I. and then the Soviet Revolution, and just utter chaos. There was actually war with Poland going on in addition to this. Every day their shtetl was being invaded by another group of either bandits or the whites or the reds or the Poles, or there was a 2-week period where their village was taken over by 6 different groups at various times. And the Jews were always at the worst end of it. It was a time of intense anti-Semitism, violence, people being shot, people. There was a story of a white general who came to the town square and whipped up the town inhabitants into an anti-Semitic frenzy with a big speech. It was also a time of famine. It was just awful. So she had to get away. She had a sister in New York, and she and her younger sister decided to go to Warsaw to get a visa to come to America. But by the time they got to Warsaw, the immigration laws in the United States had changed. So it was kind of like Muslim ban 1.0. It was the Jewish ban. So there were these new laws that were enacted by Congress that severely reduced immigration of Jews to the United States, part of a communist and hysterical fears of the time. So instead of going to America, she went to, of all places, Havana, Cuba, because there was a loophole to these new laws, which was if you could establish residency in places like Havana and also Mexico and Argentina for 1 year, and it literally spells it out in this law, you could then enter the United States and not be subject to these other quotas. And of course, the steamship companies, which were losing money from ferrying all these immigrants over to Ellis Island, were marketing Cuba, Mexico and Argentina as alternative destinations to the United States. And, so my grandmother and her sister just decided to go to Havana. And by the way, this is during the time of Prohibition. So Americans are flooding Havana to get drunk. The #1 song at the time was by Irving Berlin, "I'll See You in Cuba." And the theme of the song was, let's go to Cuba and get drunk because we can't do it in the United States. So just imagine like this tropical setting filled with alcohol tourism, every manner of debauchery that you can think of, and these 2 sisters coming from this poor, isolated shtetl and experiencing all of this. So that contrast had me intrigued. And then that led me to the situation that was in this photo. So my grandmother was getting impatient. She wanted to get to America already. And so she paid an American couple all the money she had to pretend that she was their daughter. They were vacationing in Havana, and she took the boat with them over to Key West. But the second that she got off the boat at Key West, she was immediately arrested and detained for being an undocumented immigrant. And then she was held there for 2 weeks. Eventually, she was deported back to Cuba without a penny to her name. So my novel, Hotel Cuba, is her story, much of it based on the facts, a lot of it embellished in, to make it kind of a juicier story in certain places. But that's sort of the background of this story. And what really just so intrigued me was the clash of cultures that she must have experienced going from rural, Belarus or whatever it was at that time to Havana, Cuba in the 20s.
Great. So what kind of research did you do to find out what Cuba was like in the 20s and what the Jewish experience in Cuba was like?
Yeah. So, well, we were very fortunate. And it's interesting what you're talking about earlier about, Jewish lives, what gets recorded and what doesn't. So my brother had a school assignment around in the mid 1970s. My imagination is that it was connected with the bicentennial or something. And he decided to interview my grandparents who came from that same small town. My grandfather had the classic Ellis Island story. He saw the Statue of Liberty, the whole thing. But they came separately. But my grandmother had this story. So he interviewed my grandparents about their immigration stories. And we have 7 hours of these recorded interviews done on cassette, now digitally transferred. And of those 7 hours, about 6.5 is my grandfather's story, and about half an hour is my grandmother's story. That's how it was. So that was my starting point. And my grandmother was a woman of few but emphatic words. So she really gave me the broad outlines of what had happened to her and to her sister, with a few sort of pungent details mixed in. And then it was my job to try to fill in those gaps. So I went to Cuba. That was the first thing I did. I walked around, Old Town Havana. And I also did some research, and I learned that the Jews a lot of Jews, by the way, came in this way. This was not sort of it's an unusual story in a certain sense, but there were a lot of Jews who ended up in Havana, and they tended to live in the old town, and they worked in these small kind of sweatshop, workshop situations, making clothing, making purses, making hats, which is what my grandmother ended up doing. Sometimes selling ice cream, Eskimo pies. Eskimo pies were very big in Havana at this time. Interestingly, they also sold a lot of Christian religious articles. So they were the peddlers selling the Christian tchotchkes. So they did that. They did just, all kinds of manner of things to try to make a living. Also interesting at this time, there were Jews who were already in Havana. So there were Sephardic Jews who, a lot of them came from Turkey or Syria, and they were all known as Turcos, Turkish. They're just lumped in all together. And they were there because of, trade and, sort of maritime business.
Well,
and then there were also
if they spoke Ladino, they had a leg up on the Spanish.
Probably. And then there were Americans who were there because, Americans had their clutches all over Cuba for a very long time, and they were involved in the sugar business. Sugar was huge during World War I. The price of sugar surged, and there were all these overnight millionaires in Cuba. It was a great sort of business opportunity. But as soon as the war was over, the sugar prices totally fell. And there was some interesting, I read a ton of books about this, what was going on in Cuba at the time. They were going through a real depression at the time that my grandmother arrived, to the extent that there were all these boats that were piled up in Havana Harbor containing all these luxury goods that these overnight sugar millionaires had ordered but couldn't afford to pay for anymore. And so the boats were just sitting there with the goods, and they couldn't unload them because nobody would pay for them. And they were just hoping that there would be some way to pay for them. So that was the situation that my grandmother arrived to see. And luckily, at this time, the American Jews who were there knew of HIAS, so the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that helped immigrants in Europe and in New York. And they founded their own sort of branch of HIAS they called the Ezra Society. And they were particularly looking out for young women. They were afraid that they would fall into prostitution. Interestingly, there's a scholar named Margalit Bejarano who has studied this community. And she said that actually very few Jewish women ended up falling into prostitution, if any. And I think part of the reason was that there was this group that met the women at the docks. They would take them to a place called the Mädelheim, the young women's home. They would make sure that they had something to eat. They would give them a little bit of money. They would give them lessons in Spanish. And my grandmother says that she did learn some Spanish. And they would try to find them work in a situation. And in my grandmother's case, they found her and her sister a job with a childless, middle-aged Jewish couple who owned a hat workshop. And that's where they were situated. So anyway, long story short, so I went to Havana. I also read a ton of books about the subject and went through the bibliographies and found more books. Also, because I live in DC, I got to go to the National Archive and handle original correspondence by the immigration services at the time. So United States immigration was very aware that there were a lot of people who were arriving in Cuba to try to get into the United States. And so they had agents who were in Havana at the time who were reporting back to Washington about this is what's going on the ground right now. I read memoirs. I read like so much that, it was popping out of my ears and I couldn't get enough. I wanted to find out everything that I could. And then I did a lot of research about Key West because I write about that part of the story. And I interviewed historians, including a historian of Key West, who explained to me why my grandmother might have been caught and what the situation would have been there. So anyway, that's just a little sampling of the work that I did.
I can't testify to what it was actually like in 1920s Cuba because I wasn't there in the 1920s, but I do know that from another novel that Aaron wrote called Nirvana is Here, which is set in suburban Detroit in the 1980s and early 90s, it is very much true to life. So I imagine he extends that verisimilitude to Cuba in the 20s. I was curious of sort of a trick of the trade question. You know, whenever you write about Jewish stuff to a general audience, there's a little bit of explanation. You know, you have to you can't just say she kissed the mezuzah on the way in. You have to explain what that is. So I'm curious of how you approach that, because you do write about Jewish characters in at least the two novels that I've read. You know, how do you find the balance of not being too pedantic of explaining everything, but making sure that there's enough for the non-Jewish audience or the less, you know, Jewishly literate audience to be able to know what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of been lucky in that I've always been. So my first book was set in Prague, in and around the Jewish community there. My second one was set in Israel, in Jerusalem. So I've had some experience with some of this. And so there's a certain amount of judgment that you make in your, it's interesting when they did the copy edits for Hotel Cuba to learn which words were in the Merriam-Webster dictionary and which ones were not. So there are a lot of Jewish words that now are considered part of English because they're in Merriam-Webster, and those words actually do not get italicized. Whereas if it's a word that's not, so for example, like Torah would not get italicized, but my grandmother at one point, she called one of her relatives that she did not like a machashefa, which means a witch, which also has the connotation of another word that rhymes with witch. So that word would be italicized because it's not in Merriam-Webster. But I really kind of think through, okay, what's a word that's sort of like generally known? And then if it's not known, I try to use it in context in a way that someone who doesn't know the literal meaning of it can make a good educated guess as to what it means. I don't want to slow down the narrative by throwing in like, here's a Wikipedia explanation of what this is, because I think it's not satisfying to somebody who already knows what it is. It's not satisfying to somebody who doesn't know what it is and doesn't want the story to stop to get that like dictionary definition. So I always feel like putting things in context is the best way to suggest to the reader what this might be if you don't know already what it is.
Sure. So just a couple more questions for me, and then I'm happy to open up to responses from the rest of the congregation. One of the articles you wrote about the novel had the title "Queering the Immigrant Story" or "Queering the Fiddler on the Roof" story. And I thought it was really fascinating, the scenes in Cuba where you're exploring this person's gender identity, orientation, you know, a little bit of everything there. There's something about being a dressmaker and working with women's bodies that's part of the subtext with that. And I really loved it, in part because there's a bit of modern culture that thinks that gay identity was invented at Stonewall in 1969, like that people before then just weren't gay. And part of the point of, I think, you're retelling the story by emphasizing that aspect of it is to make the point that in a society that was much less accepting than the one we're in now in the 21st century, people were still who they were and trying to squeeze into this little box. And so I'm interested in your thought on that dynamic in the book.
Yeah, well, again, you know, looking at this, you know, and I don't have any queer relatives in my immediate family. So to see my grandmother wearing, you know, this outfit, you know, for me as a gay man was just like, oh my gosh, you know, like, and I felt such a kinship with her in a way that I did, you know, when my grandmother was alive, so, and I was alive, like I was like 5, 6, 7, she was in her 80s and then her 90s. I didn't really know her as a person, you know, so to see this and to think, wow, like, you know, this was quite something. And then as I did the research, you know, I wasn't particularly like looking for like queer material or queer subject matter, but it kept coming up. I wasn't even looking for it. I was researching Havana, and then I found out about this character who in the book I call the Queen of England, but in real life he was called the Queen of Italy. And he was an out gay man in Havana in the 1890s. And he had the meanest left hook in town. He was tough. So nobody dared make fun of him for being gay because he would punch you out. You know, or you know, Ken was talking on Facebook how he loved this character of Martin, who is this sort of like butch lesbian bar owner. And she was based on a real person who was like this tough woman who owned a bar and like rowdy in the sort of like red light district of Havana. There's a lot of this stuff that was going on, and it sort of naturally bubbled up, and it would have been a lie to excise it from the story. And so I decided to let it live and to just sort of, the other thing that I think is interesting about the 20s generally was that it was a time of great, I would say, experimentation with gender identity. Androgyny was big in fashion. In the 20s in Berlin, was a huge sort of like gay and lesbian cultural revolution. I mean, when you went to like, it's kind of like if you go to Amsterdam today, and you're on like a cheesy sort of tourist tour, they'll take you to the red light district. Like in those days, if you went to Berlin and you were on the cheesy tour, you would go to a gay club or a lesbian club. Like, look, there's gay people, there's lesbians. It's like part of the tour is what you did. And Havana was a place like that. People were going there to see this kind of lifestyle that in sort of more sort of plain Jane America was not, as visible. So it was really just being truthful to the time. It was not even my pushing it, but of course I was interested in it. And fascinatingly enough, also in the shtetl, there were stories of queerness. In fact, Isaac Bashevis Singer has an amazing story of gay lovers in one of his collections. So it's and by the way, one of the great stars of the Yiddish cinema, there's a whole Yiddish cinema scene, was a woman who was very androgynous. So these things were out there.
Yeah. I mean, there's even a Yiddish term for a gay man, at least, which is to call them a fegala, like a little bird.
Little bird. Right.
Yeah, but the fact that even if there's a slur for it, means there's some,
there's a consciousness,
knowledge that there's there. Right. That's right.
Yeah.
So one other theme of the book that's of particular interest to a humanistic Jewish congregation is the grappling with God issue. And some of that's based on personal trauma, some of that's based on, difficult circumstances. It seems like at the end, there's sort of a happy, stable, conventional ending, but there's a lot of grappling with the theology in the earlier parts of the book. So maybe talk a little bit about that theme and how that worked its way in or why and so on.
Yeah. So when I did research, it was interesting because this book, it touches on many places. So it starts in the shtetl, then it's in Cuba. I mean, it starts, she's already on the way to Cuba, but she has memories of the shtetl. So I had to know what was she remembering. So I started researching how were girls brought up in the shtetl. And so boys would go to cheder and they would get a very sort of deep theological training. Women and girls were not, first of all, girls could only read one book in the official sort of Yiddish system. And I can't remember the name of it, but it wasn't
even the Tzenu Arena.
Yes. And it was a book of like myths and stories and legends. It wasn't like the Torah. It was like a version of the Torah. So Pearl, my main character, who's based on my grandmother, whose real name was Ethel, she would have been like very deeply steeped in ritual and in tradition, in kashrut and all these things. But she would not have been deeply steeped in theology. And she would have been in a world where God was like part of the fabric, like to question, like there's one point where it's like, what do you mean? Do you believe in God or do you not believe in God? And she's actually, I think at one point she finds out from her sister in New York that there's like a synagogue for Jews who don't believe in God. And she's like, how, and which is true. And she's like, how could that be possible? Wow, there's so many different, how could you pick and choose like that? This is like a new concept for her. So I wanted her to be faced with these sort of deep, because what my grandparents witnessed, I remember I was interviewing my cousin who heard a lot from his mother, was my grandmother's sister. And he said to me, if the Holocaust had not happened, we would think of what was going on in Russia in the 19 teens and 20s as the Holocaust. He was like, it was that bad, which tells you, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but it tells you both the scale of horror of the Holocaust and also the horrors of what was going on there. So my grandmother was witnessing these horrible things. And then, of course, the main character in the book suffers some deep trauma. And that's got to make you think, is there a God? I mean, or if there is, where is God? Like how can God permit this to happen? And course, we know, one of the things that often happens with trauma is sometimes bargaining with God or arguing with God or debating with God. So I found that interesting, trying to imagine how she might have had that theological quandary without being equipped with the education to hear, okay, well, here's the conversation about this that's already happened, and now where do you enter into it? So that part, and then of course, coming to Cuba and just thinking about like, what is she experiencing there? What is she seeing there? And trying to grapple with all of this.
An interesting quirk on the Tsenu Arena, which was designed for women. In fact, the title comes from "Go Out and See," but in a female plural command form. But in the frontispiece of the book, it said that this book is for women and for men who are like women.
Wow.
Now, what that meant was men who could only read Yiddish because it was in Yiddish. They had the Hebrew alphabet, but they could speak Yiddish, so they could read it. Real men, of course, could read the Hebrew and the commentaries. But that's such a sort of a fascinating little piece at the beginning of the book that is for women and for men who are like women, who couldn't handle the sophisticated material.
Amazing.
So the last question I want to ask, and I think it's an interesting question for us as we're evaluating which Jewish stories we're telling. Do you see yourself as a Jewish writer? Like if you were to be shelved on a shelf, with hyperlinking, you could be in multiple places at once. But in the old card catalogs that we grew up with, there was one location. Would you put yourself as an American writer, a Jewish, an LGBTQ writer? Where do you see those constellations of identity coming out?
So it's so funny that you asked that question. When my second book is about it's about a family who they have a dysfunctional son who is gay, and he has an overdose. He survives, and they take him to Israel on a mission, hoping that will sort of like cure him of everything that's wrong with him. And so it had a very strong, it's about the mother character and the son character. And so it's a strong Jewish component, a strong gay component. And I thought, boy, this is great. This will appeal to Jewish audiences and to gay audiences. And I was surprised that in my publisher's mind, it wasn't like gay and Jewish. It was like the Venn diagram. It was like, no, only the intersection of the two. It actually limited it more because it appealed like to,
only the gay Jews.
Yes, that was in their mind. I'm like, what are you, crazy? But in those days, I mean, when at the time the book came out, that was their united thinking. So I actually am happy that in this day and age, like we don't have to choose. Like I feel like that Jewish readers who are not gay are like much more open and like happy to read gay stories than they used to be. And also I have to say, there are some like gay readers who are not Jewish who are like, do I really want to read this Jewish story? And now I don't think that's quite as much of a thing either. I think we're like, one of the kind of nice things about like woke or whatever you want to call it is that we've become a little more curious and open and interested in like these sort of complications of identity. So I never like to really limit myself as anything, like I definitely, I see myself as all the things that you mentioned, but like Philip Roth, sort of like the grand Jewish American writer, I am tremendously inspired by British literature. And so is Philip Roth, who's a huge fan of like Thomas Hardy, for example, Henry James, who's sort of American British. The Brits claim him. They're always surprised when Americans claim Henry James, but it's true, but all of the British writers. And interestingly, Hotel Cuba was very much informed by Jane Austen's novel, Sense and Sensibility. For those of you who don't know it, it's about two sisters, one who is more sort of sensible and practical, and the other one who's more kind of flighty and romantic, which was how I portrayed, the main character of Pearl based on my grandmother, the more sturdy, sensible one who's more buttoned up, in part because she's experienced a lot of trauma and she just has to get through life and just has to like make it. Versus her younger sister who's more sheltered and more flighty and more romantic and more sort of bubbly and able to kind of experience the world through that romantic lens in a way that my Pearl is not quite so able to do at first, although she changes over the course of the book. So I take from everywhere and from everything.
That's great. Well, so I'd like to open it up. If anyone else has any comments or questions, thoughts about the book, we'd love to hear it. Yeah, Andrew, I see, and then Victoria.
So Aaron, I said before that I love the book.
Thank
So,
you.
so I didn't know that it was based on your grandmother's story, and that's really cool to find out. So the book ends with your grandmother, where it's very ambiguous as to whether your grandmother is
Don't
gay or not.
spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Okay, it's
Don't give away too much.
ambiguous,
Yeah.
and it's ambiguous as to what happens to her younger sister Frida. What did happen to her? You know, what was their life like for the next 60 years? Do you know?
So I'll give you the real life version, and actually, it's in a little bit of is in the acknowledgments of the book. So my grandmother and her sister married my grandfather and his brother. So two sisters married two brothers. They ended up going into business together. The two brothers, they opened a grocery store in Detroit, and they worked together for a lot of years. They also built a house together, and they lived together in the same house. So my grandparents lived on the bottom floor, and their siblings lived on the top floor. Over the years, relations between them increasingly frayed. As my grandparents said of their siblings, they were with the kind of people who play cards. You know, it was those, and then, you know, they ended up moving out of the house. They still were working together, but they were having issues. And then one day, my grandfather's brother came up to him and said, I don't want to be in the business with you anymore. I want either, you know, we sell it, or I want you to get out, and I want to put my son in the business in your place. I've had it. And so my grandfather came home in tears, told my grandmother what happened. My grandmother stomped off to tell her sister, how dare you, all this stuff. And my brother, she talks about this in the recording. My brother says, what did you say to her? And my grandmother says, not nice words. And they had a huge falling out, and they never spoke to each other for the rest of their lives. And I'm talking 40 years. So it was a big, you know, rift in the family. And so they had been so close. But I think what happened is, you know, when you've suffered the kind of trauma that they went through, and by the way, their whole family, a big portion of the family stayed behind in the shtetl. The rule was, if you were single, you went to America. If you were married, you stayed behind in Russia. Everybody who stayed behind in Russia were killed by the Nazis in 1941 and 1942. So the whole family is wiped out, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, nephews, nieces, everybody. And all they have is each other. And that puts such a like hothouse pressure on the relationships that are in America. I think it just kind of broke them. So in the end,
There was a third sister in America too.
And a fourth, actually. So I condensed the family a little bit, you know, 11 in real life, 6 in the book. There were 2 sisters in New York. In real life, I made it 1. But interestingly, I have heard from the descendants of all of the families since this book has come out. And a couple of them actually came to, I was just at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, and I got to meet the great-granddaughters of my grandmother's sister and stuff. But so one of the sisters who was in New York had a daughter who married a guy who was a very prominent academic, and he knew a lot about like psychology and stuff. And he ended up being the head of one of the displaced persons camps in Europe that the Holocaust survivors were placed in. And he led a huge protest about the conditions that the American army had put them in, and was really fighting for their rights. So interesting where people wind up. But yeah, all the people in America, they end up having families, and families that had families, and they ended up thriving in America.
Right. I saw Victoria's hand, and I think AJ wants to jump in as well after that.
Yeah, Victoria. And Ken has a hand up too.
Oh,
Thank you. So I also love the book. I actually listened to it, so it's a little bit of a different experience. And one of the things that I found is, like, you know, when you're reading a book with really good writing, but you're reading it with the eyeball method of reading. You stop and you write things down. So it's much less likely to do it when you're listening. But there were many points, and I think this is what happens when there's good writing, is that you're thinking, I have like amorphous thoughts in my head that aren't, I couldn't articulate these ideas. They're floating around. And then you read this sentence, and I'm just going to read this sentence because I stopped. I copied it down, which is, walking my dog. When are you listening to a book? And this is when Pearl, they're in Cuba and they're in the club. She's with the gentleman. She said, just as she originally suspected, a man cannot be both a Jew and an aristocrat. Alexander's wife wouldn't be a great lady in a mansion, but another part of the disguise of a hanger-on, neutered flatterer, dependent on others for status. And I listened to that. I was like, oh, it's wow. I just thought, wow, what a way to articulate these floating ideas. I really loved your writing.
Thank you.
And the other thing that I thought was really interesting, food for thought, I read the NPR interview that you did, and it was just a lot. One of the subjects that came up was what was available for people who arrive. They don't know anyone, they don't speak the language. To me, that seems utterly terrifying to land in Cuba. What is this place? It's like tropical. You've come for, like another planet, and you don't know what to expect, and you don't have anything. So, in the part where the woman comes up to her and says, sort of like, we have a system, and it turned out to be an okay system. It wasn't anything, horrifying. And I think just made me think a lot about, that's exactly what we are struggling to provide now. People arrive at the border, same terrifying situation it must be. And then what do we have available? And and sometimes it's good, and sometimes, boy, are we falling short of,
Yes.
so I just thought that was very timely and really interesting to think about.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that I started, thinking of the idea of this book in 2017, early 2018. And, so just a couple of things. When I went to the National Archives and I was reading both the correspondence between like the immigration officials of the time, and also letters that everyday Americans were writing to, by the way, immigration was covered by the Department of Labor in those days. And they were writing, and they're talking about protecting the purity of the American blood pool, that we have to keep out these foreigners that are going to like ruin our blood pool, but some of the language was exactly identical to the language that you hear today. They're taking our jobs, there can't be real Americans. They come from cultures that have different values, and they can't possibly adopt our values. The uncanny echoes were just astounding. And part of the sort of story of this book was in 2017, there was a writers' convention here in Washington, D.C., where I live. And a group of writers said that they wanted to go to Capitol Hill and knock on all the doors of all the senators' offices and lobby for progressive causes and do what we could. Everybody was in such confusion in 2017, who at least shared my sort of political bent. And nobody had taken Michigan. I'm originally from Michigan. So I said, I'll do Michigan. So I had just found this picture. So I brought a copy of this picture with me to visit Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. I went to her. In those days, they had like open office hours at certain times. So all these lobbyists in their suits and their printed folders and everything. And there's like this dopey writer with this picture of his grandmother. But then it was like my turn to meet the senator. And I said, hello, Senator Stabenow. This is a picture of my grandmother. I want to tell you about her story. She was an immigrant, and I want you to protect the rights of immigrants today in her honor. And the senator said, oh, I agree with you 100%. And I thought, boy, that's the easiest lobbying job I ever heard of. And I said to her, well, what can I do to support you? in this fight. And she said, "You're a writer, tell your grandmother's story." And I had not really thought of doing it, and for a long time afterward, I was like, well, I don't really write historical fiction. Is this something I know how to do? But those words kind of like never left me. And so I ended up taking her advice and writing this story. And I'll just show you. This is the beauty of Zoom. So I recently went to the senator's office, and I dropped off a signed copy of the book for her, and she wrote me a note to say thank you for it. So anyway, so
That's
made
great.
a little impact. Yeah.
So AJ and then Ken and then Son.
So my family is also from David Horodoko.
That's amazing. Are you part of the David Horodok organization?
So my great aunt was very involved, Bessie Kutnick, through the Sharet Tzedek group. And they all came, all 6 siblings and the parents all came. And there's this picture, they lived on the border near Turov. And there's this picture of the going away party. And it's got like 40 people in it in front of like the tiniest little shed. And they're like, the going away party, in front of, the shed. That's like the name of it. And there's like 40 people in it. But my grandfather was the youngest. So he was born in 24 and they came in 26 or 27.
Wow.
And they even, some of the family had gone, some of his brothers went back and were killed in that 1941 riot. But my mother's great grandmother is buried in Windsor, Ontario. So
Amazing.
my other question though, I don't think I looked it up. I don't think we're related, but you never know. You never know with David Horodoko. But your imagery of the color in Cuba versus the grayness in New York, and that while Pearl was in Cuba, she didn't appreciate the color, but when she got to New York, she's like, well, why am I here?
Yeah.
Because it's, and then you go to Detroit, and we know what Detroit looked like in the 20s, and it wasn't vibrant, but like it wasn't vibrant like Cuba, but it was, a lovely place to live. And so I'm wondering if what you thought about that juxtaposition, and like why Pearl just all of a sudden wanted to make everything settle down in Detroit, like after all the time in Cuba and going to New York and dreaming back about Cuba and what her life was like. She moves to Detroit. 3 months later, she's married and she's settled there.
So
I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Sorry.
It's all right.
I'm sorry. Read the book first.
But read the book anyway. Yeah. I mean, obviously, everybody knows my grandmother did make it to the United States because here I am. So that was one of the things that I noticed when I was in Havana, in Cuba, was like the bright light and the colors and the vegetation. And, and as I was reading about life in the shtetl, it was mud, and really
everyone was covered with mud.
Everybody was covered in mud like all the time. You couldn't escape
pictures.
It. Yeah. See, just imagining like that contrast. And then my grandmother talks about when she, finally gets to New York and is reunited with her sisters. And she says in her recording, when I saw how my sisters were living in New York, I wanted to go back to Russia. She's like, that's how bad. And when you know how bad the poverty was in Russia, for her to say that tells you something. And then if you've been to like the Tenement Museum in New York, or when you read, these sort of the conditions of people in New York City, the immigrants. And it's interesting today's immigrants also, I used to teach English as a foreign language or second language, whatever you call it, in New York. And a lot of my students said their first reaction to coming to New York City was how dirty it was. Because and a lot of them, the image of New York had been formed by Sex in the City. And they thought it was like going to be all glamorous and, and these, big modern buildings. And they were just like shocked, like, oh my God, it's so dirty and like cramped and crowded. I think America gets mythologized to such an extent. And, particularly, for these immigrants like my grandmother, the Golden Medina, what country could live up to that huge mythology that was around it? And then of course the conditions were really tough in New York at the time. Detroit, interestingly enough, in the 1920s was called the Paris of the West. It was a boom town. I mean, imagine like the oil industry, in Texas in like the 50s and 60s or something. I mean, cars were all the rage. It was like Apple, Apple computers. And there's only one place that made them. It was Detroit, so people were flocking there. And I even read that if you wore like a factory uniform, a car factory uniform, you were a guy, you could get any girl you wanted. I mean, you were like a star. You were making money. You were in the hot industry, and there were new buildings going up. It was a boom town. So in a way, it kind of, I mean, of course, this is really what happened. My grandmother really did make the decision to come to Detroit, but that's why so many immigrants were attracted to Detroit. It was a real place of opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, and half of, David Horodoko ended up in Detroit.
Right. Well, and once one comes, everybody else joins,
Exactly.
once we're there. Yeah.
Ken, please, and then Sandra.
Yeah. So, going back to Adam's question about the Venn diagram, the intersection between LGBTQ or Jewish, what I found really interesting, like there was a point, and this kind of goes into Victoria's statement as well, when you're reading and you can stop and you can go back and look at what you've just read. And I found like the structure of your sentences were very Yiddish. It was almost like there's a Sholem Aleichem, piece, sitting on your shoulder and saying, structure your sentence like this, because that's how she would have talked. And even points where she's not having a conversation, you really captured that, that sentence structure. And I thought that was really tremendous. It really like brought me in right away into like, okay, yeah, this is the fiddler part. This is the, I'm going to draw in, like you brought her alive, and then hearing about how your grandfather monopolized, this whole interview from the 70s, and like, it's almost like, yeah, he had his time. He got to tell his story. Now I get to tell her story. And so that, hearing about that is really fascinating. But yeah, it just like, it really was like, wow, this is real. You really felt her. You really felt Pearl and Ethel, and really happy for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I listened to those recordings over and over and over again, and not so much necessarily to get like the facts or the details, but just to get the cadences of how they spoke. And I tried to perfume the narration with that kind of cadence. So absolutely. But I do want to say, I don't want to make my grandfather seem like he was like this like horrible like male chauvinist, because he was actually the furthest thing from that. Although perhaps his brother would have qualified. But it was just kind of like he had an amazing life and incredible experiences and near-death things, and was, impressed in the German army, and like all kinds of things happened to him. But my grandmother was as I say, she was a woman of few but emphatic words. And my grandfather was in business. He was a rock hunter. He was more comfortable talking and joking and kibitzing. And then I feel like people just like, it was more kind of systemic, the sexism of it. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, well, that's just like a little story of how she stopped in Cuba. Nobody really sort of thought like, it would be worthy of further digging, and they would kind of push her to move forward. And listening to it, I was feeling a little frustrated. I was like, no, wait, I want to know what was the food like, that's novelist in me. Like, I wanted to press on it. So, but I don't think it was like really such like a conscious kind of like, let's push her down, but just sort of like, it was just in the air, like, oh, this is the man story. We got to get to it. And then their natural personalities, my grandmother was no pushover. My grandfather was more of a pushover than she was in a certain sense. But she wasn't like a big talker, let's say. She was a woman of few but emphatic words.
Okay. And I liked how you used food, watching your Facebook and knowing, how much cooking is important to you, which I appreciate a lot. The way you talked about the kosher food, and then watching, Frida, sneak a hot dog, and that was great.
Well, food is just so important in any a novel. I remember hearing Margaret Atwood once talking about her practice, and she says, I'm always worried, what do my characters have to eat and drink, and where are they sleeping? We think about it all day long. We're constantly making choices about food, and particularly for women, food was a way that they related to tradition, to religion. Again, they didn't have that formal education in theology, but they had a very deep knowledge of what's kosher, what's not kosher, how to prepare the food. And it was interesting in there, my grandparents they lived through like the Soviet Revolution, World War I. But they weren't so concerned with that in their recordings. What my grandfather was like furious about, 50 years later, was, my grandmother's sister was not a great cook, and my grandmother was trying to teach her how to cook. And he said, oh, and can you believe she mixed up potato and horseradish? Can you believe it? How could you mix up potato and horseradish? It's totally different, but she mixed them up. He was going on and on about this 50 years later, and it really was kind of instructive to me of like what was on their minds as opposed to like what was on my mind as somebody looking back, try to reconstruct this historic period.
You could almost taste the fruit from Cuba too.
Yeah, the mango. Yeah.
Right. Sandra, please.
Oh, hi, I got my sound on. I'm going to bring it back full circle to something you started with at the beginning of your talk. The photo of your grandmother cross-dressed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the story of that, and can you reveal it without ruining the book? Because I've not read the book.
So, part of why I wanted to write this book was to figure out why the heck was she wearing this outfit? And in fact, in her interviews, and it's relatively short and skimpy on details, she mentions wearing this outfit. She describes herself wearing this outfit. This picture actually takes place in Key West. And so I was able to figure out the circumstances of the picture and the location. So when I went to Key West to do research, I was walking around with this picture everywhere I could, trying to match up like the spindles on this balcony and trying to figure out, like, where was this taken? So interestingly, I met with a historian of Key West who told me that when immigrants were caught, trying to get in without papers to Key West, if they were not Jewish, they put them in jail. But if they were Jewish, they didn't put them in jail. Why? Because of kosher food. They couldn't figure out what to feed them. So instead, they were remanded to the custody of the Jewish community of Key West. And in her recording, my grandmother talks about this man named Schulsinger. And she says to him, my father is a cantor. He's a Schulsinger too, like you. So treat me better. And so it began to dawn on me that she perhaps, was staying with this guy named Schulsinger, who turns out to have been the rabbi of Key West at the time. His name was Rabbi Lazarus Schulsinger, who was suspected of being involved in rum smuggling and immigrant smuggling. And if you were smuggling rum, you were also smuggling immigrants because same boat. And then I happened to walk past the former synagogue of Key West, which today is a Sarah Beth's brunch restaurant. And I looked so the sanctuary is the restaurant, and next to the sanctuary is the former living quarters where the rabbi would have lived with his family. And I noticed that the second floor what was now an enclosed space was, in the past, it would have been a balcony. I realized it was a balcony that had been enclosed. And I looked at the roof line of the next house, and I realized it was the roof line of the building next door. So it's the balcony of the rabbi's living quarters. That's where this picture was taken. But why was she wearing this outfit? I don't know. And I never was able to solve the mystery. And it's part of the, you know, I will never figure it out. You know, the only thing that I can say is that I did discover that a lot of women at this period, one way that women who did not have documents and wanted to get in the United States would get in was by cross-dressing as sailors, because they never checked documents for sailors. So sailors would come and go from the port and nobody cared.
Okay.
Perhaps that was the answer. Androgyny was a thing in women's fashion, although not that was not what this was. So can't tell you for sure, but I did make up my own story to answer that question. So if you read the book, you'll see my
Okay.
guess at.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
Any other last comments or questions for Erin before we finish up?
Well,
Well,
I just
Erin,
want to say
was there
thank you
something?
so much for sharing your space with me this evening, and your questions, and thanks to everybody who read the book. I'm just so honored that you read it and loved it, and just a big thank you.
Great. And thanks to Ken for connecting us. And thanks again to Erin for joining us tonight.